So you want to know how to create a project charter but have no idea where to start? Well, stay tuned because I'll be telling you all about that in this video. Hello YouTube family, welcome back to my channel. My name is Christina and this is Cultivated Chrissy. Now in today's video, I am talking all about the project charter, okay? What it is not, who completes it, and of course, what's included in it. So let's jump right into it. So what is the project charter? Well, the project charter is one of those first documents that you're going to fill out as part of your project. And as I stated in some previous videos, it defines the who, what, when, where, why, and how of your project, right? It does this by defining the scope and the parameters, right? It tells you why it's needed, who's involved in it, what the entire purpose of this is, and what could potentially impact the project. But we'll get into all of that in this video. So one of the questions that comes up when it comes to the project charter is this really needed? Now, I'm going to tell you right now, you definitely don't want to skip this step, right? It's foundational for your project. Like I said before in some previous videos, this is definitely something that can be referenced throughout the project, right? It's a 1 to 2 page document that tells you all you need to know about the project, right? From a high level. And it's so important to have all of that documented. You don't want to be in a meeting and someone's asking, why do we need to do this? What is the whole purpose of this project? All of that. This document answers all of those questions and it can really help you in decision making along the way. So you definitely don't want to skip this step. You will regret it. So make sure that you don't skip the project charter. So let's briefly talk about what a project charter is not. Some people think that they can use a business case document to replace a project charter, but the business case is something that you do before your project even starts, right? And it's really something that leadership is really involved in putting together, right? Or a project analyst or someone like that, right? A business analyst, they usually put that document together. And it really, for the problem that you're trying to solve, right? It really puts together other project options. It looks at cost benefit analysis, right? Your return on investment or your ROI, right? And those different topics are entirely different from you fleshing out high level details about the selected project, right? Which is what the project charter is meant to do. So those documents, while both important, they're also very different and serve different purposes, right? So I wouldn't try to replace one with the other. They're both very different, both useful, but again, different. So secondly, people think that they can use a scope of work document to replace a project charter. Now, project charters, right, are very high level documents, right? Scope of work documents are very detailed. You'll find scope of works attached to contracts and things like that, right? That really outlines every requirement that you want the vendor to hit, or as a project, what you want the project to hit, right? At the time that you're writing the project charter, you may not have all of that information flushed out, right? You're going to have very high level details. And so the scope of work is something that should happen probably later, right? After you've done your requirements gathering, you can gather all of that information and put it into a scope of work document, right? And if you want, you can combine some elements of the project charter and put it into the scope of work document. But they serve two different purposes once again, right? One is high level, one is more detailed, right? And I do find that if you do combine it, people don't want to look at all of that information, right? It makes the document way longer. So I would separate them, right? But again, both are useful, just different. Now, this is also the same for a business requirement document or BRD. Again, very detailed document, just like the scope of work, okay? So you may not have all of that information at the start of your project, which is when you're filling out the project charter. Again, useful, but different. So let's talk about who completes the project charter. Now, depending on how advanced your organization is, or your PMO, your project management office, right? That's a department. Depending on how advanced that is, they may come to you with a completed project charter, right? I find that that's the less likely situation, but it could happen, right? The more likely scenario is that leadership or your project sponsor, right, is going to come to you with a concept, right, or an idea. They have a problem that they would like to solve, right? And hopefully they've done a business case and understand that this particular project is what they're going to use to solve the problem, right? And there's ROI backing that information and all of that, right? But they need you to help them with the implementation and to put the details of that together, right? And of course, you start that with a project charter. So you're going to then gather some key stakeholders, right, along with the project sponsor, some key decision makers, and you're going to work with them to fill out the project charter together, right? You can also gather them in a meeting, collect the information, go back and write it yourself, pull it together, and of course, make sure that it's reviewed and approved before deeming it complete. All right, so that is who completes the project charter. All right, so we talked about what the project charter is, what it is not, and who completes it. So let's jump into what's included in it. So I'm going to break down what's included in the project charter into categories: scope, background, stakeholders, budget, time frame, and potential impacts. Let's go through them all. So scope is the first category. In the project charter, your scope helps you to define your goals, what are you trying to accomplish, and the work that you're going to need to do in order to accomplish those goals, right? So essentially, what are you trying to accomplish, right? And how are you going to achieve that? So one of the sections that helps you to define the scope of your project is the SMART goal. I like to include a SMART goal right at the top of my project charter, right? And when I say SMART, I mean that it is specific, it is measurable, attainable, relevant, and time-bound, okay? It is a very clear objective statement that tells you what we're trying to accomplish, by when, right? How we're gonna measure that, all of that. Very clear objective statement. That is what I include right at the top. So if you're in healthcare like me, here's an example of a SMART goal that you can use. Reduce wait times in the ER by 35% from patient registration to intake by September 30th, 2023. So the next section that defines the scope of the project is deliverables. Now this helps you to answer the question, what has to happen in order to deem this project complete, right? Again, this is high level, so you may not have all the answers, right? But it tells you those key milestones in the project, right? What are those key outputs or the product, services, or results that are going to lead to that overall product, service, or result for the project, right? It tells you metrics that you need to complete, all of that. So again, this is very high level, but it helps you to define the scope as well. Now, where possible, you want to make sure that you write these deliverables in a SMART fashion, right? And we already talked about what SMART is, right? When we talked about our goals. I do find, however, that with the T, if you're adding times to your deliverables, those dates do become arbitrary. So I would leave the T out unless you have a constraint specifically binding you to a deadline for those deliverables, okay? So that is the deliverable section. So the next section that helps you to define the scope, right, is the in-scope section and the out-of-scope section, right? They could be written in one kind of table or separated, right? But you don't want to skip this because this tells you the project parameters, right? What's going to be included as part of the project and what's absolutely not going to be included as part of the project, right? You want to make sure you define that because there's going to be conversations where people try to slip things in to the project scope, and you want to make sure that it's clearly defined what's included and what's not included. So that is the purpose of that section. So that concludes the scope category. Let's get into background. So background is really important because it defines the why, right? Why are we doing this? It could also provide some additional insight into some additional problems that the project may solve, right? And you could possibly add some deliverables around that too. So very important section. So one of the sections that helps to define the background is the problem statement. This can also be referred to as an opportunity statement, but essentially it's telling you what is the problem that we're trying to resolve, right? What gap are we trying to fill? It helps you to define that. So we use the ER wait times example for the SMART goal. So let's get into some examples of what would go into the problem statement for that project. We noticed a reduction in patient intakes. Patients are going to other hospitals. We got our HCAHPS scores back, right? And they're really low. This is a patient satisfaction survey. And this is going to cause a reduction in our Medicaid reimbursement dollars. So this really tells you why this project is needed, right? If things are going to affect your bottom line, if you're scoring low on surveys, right? If you have patients coming in less and less into your facility, right? That tells you why, right? This is why this project is needed. So again, the problem statement helps you to define why are you doing this project? And at the end of it, you want to make sure that your project is actually addressing that in the end. Let's get into the next section of the background. So the next section that defines background is customer value, right? And customer value really helps you to define what's important to both your internal and your external customers, right? Internal being your employees, right? Your staff members. And it helps you to define what's important to them, right? What they find valuable. At the end of the day, your project is supposed to solve a problem, right? And it's supposed to create value. And so you want to make sure that you're defining that clearly in this section and able to speak to that throughout the project, right? You want to make sure that you're providing communications throughout your project that say, this is why we're doing this. We know this is important to you, right? And here's how we're going to solve the problem, right? You may not know that all of the answers when you first start the project, right, at the time of the project charter. But eventually, when you do know that, you want to make sure that you're communicating that in what's important to the customer, right, in that voice. Now, if you're finding this video helpful and thorough so far, I have all of this and so much more documented in a project charter template. Now, this is a charter template that I have developed throughout multiple years working in healthcare and doing projects across multiple industries, right? And have actually had this template adopted by these organizations. And so I know that it is extremely helpful, right? I have a blank version of the template as well as an annotated version of the template, and it is annotated using descriptions on how to complete each section, as well as prompting questions, right? If you're in a meeting and you're facilitating the completion of this document, these questions will help you to facilitate getting the answers you need and documented for your project charter. So it is extremely, extremely helpful. I know it is proven and tried. I will leave a link to it down below. So the next category is stakeholders, right? This helps you to define who is going to be involved in your project, right? As well as who's impacted by the project, right? So as far as who's going to be involved, this is your project team. We want to keep this to no more than 7 people. Anything outside of that, it starts to get overwhelming, too many voices, all of that. So those key 7 people that are going to be involved in your project, you want to define that, right? Outside of that, like I said, you want to talk about who's impacted by your project. These are both directly impacted and indirectly impacted, right? You also want to make sure that included in that is your customer voice, right? So whoever your customers are, both internal and external, you want to include them as well in the stakeholder list, because you may be able to bring them in from time to time throughout the project as your subject matter experts or your SMEs, okay? So that is the stakeholder category. You want to make sure that you define that as well. So the next category is budget, right? Again, this is high level. This is the project charter. You may not know everything at the time that you're completing this, right? But you want to make sure that at a high level, you can define what's going to be needed as far as resources on the project, right? Resources including personnel, right? Your staff, any labor that needs to be done, right? Also equipment or materials. You want to define that in this section. Again, we're keeping it high level. Make sure to include a contingency part of the budget, like a buffer, right? In case that's needed. So time frame is the next category, and it's pretty self-explanatory, but I like to break my time frame up into 2 parts, right? And that is my required completion date, right? If you have a specific constraint that's driving the completion of your project, right? Whether it's state-based, whether it's your organization providing that constraint, whatever, I like to include that required completion date as well as the target date, right? Which can be on or before that required date. Usually you want to do that as a before date, right? So I like to define both of those in my time frame section. So the next category is potential impacts, right? And you define this in a couple of sections, right? In constraints, your assumptions, your dependencies, and your risks, right? So we're going to define what each of those mean. So constraints is the first one. And we kind of talked about this already in terms of time frames, but these are the things on your project that you have no control over, right? Things that you cannot change, okay? These can be dates, right? They can be systems that are in place, structures that are in place, right? But you don't have any control over these things. So you want to think about what these things are in your project and document them in the constraint section. You might need to build things into your project in order to work around these items, right? So you want to define that. So the next section is assumptions, right? And you're assuming, right, that you're going to have certain things in place in order to complete your project. You can also think about these as dependencies, right? Certain things need to be started, certain things need to be completed in order for you to be able to do something else, right? So you want to write down what these things are that you're assuming are going to be in place or finished or completed, all of that in order for you to do the work that has been promised. That is the assumption section. So the next section is risks. And you want to make sure that you're defining what could potentially knock your project off track, right? We made promises in terms of scope, time, and resources for this project. And so we want to think about all the things that could potentially knock one of those things off balance, right? And we're documenting that in this section. Now, as I explained in my previous video, there can sometimes be taboo about writing risks, right? Some people may think that you think they can't do their job in some way, right? Or if they're pitching the project, it may be a deterrent for actually implementing something like this, right? Something like your project. But you want to make sure that you're driving home the point that this is what can happen, not what has happened, right? Risks are issues that have not come to fruition, right? Once a risk happens, it is an issue, right? And so sometimes people have issue trackers and things like that. But these are what your risks are. are very important, right? You want to plan ahead so that when something happens, you already have a plan in place, can quickly implement it, right? And you can keep your project as on track as possible, right? As close to what you originally promised as possible. So very good step here to be proactive and to be able to deliver your project in what was promised. So once you've completed all the sections of the project charter, you want to make sure that your project sponsor signs off on it, right? This is really important because it tells everyone this document has been reviewed, it's been approved, right? And you're able to start pulling together resources to start the implementation of the project. Very important step. You also want to make sure that if any changes are happening to the project charter, you're keeping track of the versions, right? All of this is shown on our project charter template that you can download, but you want to make sure that you're keeping track of any versions, right? And any changes that are happening with the document. So again, along with the information provided in this video, I also have the project charter template that I've created. You can download that in the link below, right? It has that annotated version of the template with the probing questions and descriptions. Really helpful document. If you found this video helpful, then go ahead and leave a like. If you have any questions, comment below and make sure you subscribe because there's so much more to come. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in my next one. Bye.